The first thing I noticed about my own kitchen was that the mug rack was on the wrong wall. I stood in the doorway in a cardigan that wasn't mine, in a house that was supposed to be mine, and watched my sister pour coffee into a mug I'd bought on our honeymoon in Charleston. She handed it to my husband without looking at him, the way you hand someone something 1,000 times over 10 years, the way marriage looks when it's worn in and comfortable and real. Marin. Elise said my name like it was a word she'd forgotten how to pronounce. The coffee pot shook in her hand. You're supposed to be at the care facility. They called. They said you just got up. I did, I said. I got up. Grant hadn't turned around yet. He was still facing the window, both hands braced on the counter, shoulders locked like a man bracing for an impact he'd known was coming for 10 years and had simply chosen not to think about. Say something, I told him. When he finally turned, his face did something I will never forget for the rest of my life. It rearranged itself, in real time, from a man's face into a stranger's face. Grief and guilt and something uglier all at once, something that looked almost like relief that the waiting was finally over. You weren't supposed to wake up, Elise said. Not cruel yet. Just true. Just the truest thing anyone had said to me since I opened my eyes in a hospital bed 11 days earlier and asked a nurse what year it was. Then she said the thing. The thing that would end up being the only sentence from that entire decade I would ever need to remember, word for word, down to the flat, tired cruelty in her voice. You were gone, Marin. I didn't take your life. I just kept it warm for you, because somebody had to. I looked at my husband's ring on her hand. I looked at the mug rack on the wrong wall. I looked at the life I had built with my own 2 hands being worn like a coat that fits someone else now. 10 years is a long time to keep something warm, Elise, I said. Long enough that you forgot whose it actually was. But to understand how we got here, you need to go back to the spring before the accident, back before the coma, back before the wedding photos got quietly retaken with a different bride, back to when I was just a 34-year-old woman running a small design studio in Boise, Idaho, who thought her biggest problem was a client who wouldn't pay an invoice on time. My name is Marin Voss, and before any of this happened, my life ran on a schedule so predictable you could set a watch by it. Up at 6. Coffee in the blue mug from Charleston. A 20-minute drive to the studio I'd built from nothing. Voss and Cantrell Design, a small industrial design firm tucked into a converted warehouse near the Boise River, where I designed ergonomic hardware for medical equipment manufacturers. It wasn't glamorous work. Most people's eyes glazed over when I explained what I did. But I was good at it, good enough that 6 years earlier I'd filed a patent, on my own, under my maiden name, for a folding 4-pole mechanism that 3 different hospital supply companies now licensed for a modest but steady royalty. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine, filed before Grant and I married, sitting quietly in a drawer of paperwork nobody ever asked about because nobody thought to. Grant handled the business side of the studio, contracts, invoicing, client relationships. He was good at charm in a way I never was. People liked him instantly. I grew on people slowly, like a stain you didn't notice until it had already set. We'd married 8 years earlier, in a small ceremony at my parents' house in McCall, Idaho, with my twin sister Elise as my maid of honor, cornflowers in her hair, crying harder than I did during the vows. Elise had always been the twin who needed things a little more than I did. Not in a way anyone judged her for, just a quiet, constant gravity to her, like she was always standing slightly in my shadow and slightly resentful of the shade. She'd moved to Boise 2 years after we did, after her second divorce, and I'd helped her get on her feet the way you help a sister. A couch to sleep on for 3 months, a design job at my own studio doing marketing layouts, introductions to half my client list. She was talented. She was also, I would eventually understand, someone who had spent 34 years watching me get the version of life she thought she deserved. My best friend Priya Malhotra ran the framing shop 2 doors down from my studio, and most mornings I'd swing by for a coffee before opening up, the 2 of us complaining about landlords and clients in the same easy rhythm we'd had since design school. My neighbor, Walt Doyle, a retired Air Force mechanic who lived alone with a dog named Biscuit, watered my tomato plants whenever Grant and I traveled, and never once forgot. There were, in hindsight, exactly two things that should have told me something was wrong. The first, about 4 months before the accident, I came home early from a site visit and found Elise and Grant in the kitchen, standing closer together than the conversation seemed to require, both of them stepping apart a half-second too quickly when the door opened. Grant said she was helping him pick an anniversary gift for me. I believed him because believing him was easier, and because the alternative required imagining something about my own sister that I didn't have room in my head for. The second, 3 weeks before the accident, my attorney at the time, an older man named Thomas Reyes who was retiring, called to confirm he'd updated my will and the patent licensing paperwork to reflect that I wanted everything routed through a trust in my name only, separate from marital assets, just to keep the structure clean, he'd said, in case anything ever gets complicated. I remember thinking it was an odd thing to do on a random Tuesday. I signed it anyway. Some instinct in me, some quiet animal part of my brain, had known something the rest of me hadn't caught up to yet. Then came the ice storm in late January, the black patch on Highway 55 outside McCall, and a semi-truck that crossed the center line 4 car lengths ahead of me. I don't remember the impact. I remember leaving my parents' cabin after a weekend visit, and then I remember, 10 years later, fluorescent lights and a stranger's voice asking if I knew my own name. I woke up on a Tuesday in March, though I wouldn't know it was March or a Tuesday, or that 10 years had passed, until a neurologist named Dr. Okafor sat at the edge of my bed with a gentleness that scared me more than any bad news would have. "Marin, I need you to stay calm," she said. "You've been in a persistent, minimally responsive state following a traumatic brain injury. You're at sawtooth rehabilitation and continuing care. Do you know what year you think it is?" I told her. She corrected me by a full decade. The next 11 days were a strange, slow unspooling. Physical therapy to relearn how my legs worked, cognitive assessments, a small mercy of a social worker named Denise who explained gently, in pieces, what I'd missed. My parents had passed, 2 years apart, both of natural causes, while I lay in a hospital bed unable to grieve them. My father's heart. My mother, 18 months later, of what Denise delicately called a broken heart that also happened to be congestive heart failure. I had missed both funerals. I had missed a decade of birthdays, of holidays, of a whole world continuing to spin without me in it. And Grant. Grant had visited every week for the first 3 years, Denise told me, hopeful and devoted, and then the visits had tapered, not stopped, just thinned, the way grief thins when you decide, quietly, to start living again. 4 years ago, she said, Grant had filed for what the state considered permissible dissolution of marriage under Idaho's incapacity provisions, a legal process available when a spouse has been unresponsive beyond a certain threshold. The paperwork had gone through with a court-appointed guardian ad litem reviewing my interests, since I couldn't speak for myself. He'd remarried 14 months later. To my sister. I asked Denise to say it again, certain I'd misheard the way you mishear things in a dream. She hadn't misspoke. Grant Cantrell and Elise Voss had married in a small courthouse ceremony and had been living in the house Grant and I had bought together for the past 2.5 years. There's something else, Denise said, and I could see her weighing how much a person recovering from 10 years of nothing could actually absorb. Your sister has been managing your business's affairs since your incapacity. Voss and Cantrell Design. She and your husband, she paused on the word, apologizing with her eyes for using it, took over full operational control after the dissolution. I didn't cry. I want that on the record, because everyone assumes you cry. I sat very still in a bed that wasn't mine, in a body that had aged 10 years while my mind had stayed exactly 34, and I felt something colder than grief settle into my chest. Something more like arithmetic. Somewhere in this story, there was a decade of decisions made in my name, without my voice, and I intended to account for every single one of them. I'd like to be discharged, I told Dr. Okafor, once my physical therapy cleared the minimum threshold. I'd like to go home. She looked at me for a long moment. Your home is currently occupied, Marin. I'm aware, I said. That's exactly why I'd like to go there. Before I went anywhere, I asked Denise for one thing: my old storage unit. Grant had apparently kept a small unit off Chinden Boulevard with my personal effects, clothes, keepsakes, papers, things too personal to throw away but too complicated to keep in the house he now shared with my sister. Walt Doyle drove me there himself. He'd heard I was awake through the small world grapevine of a neighborhood that doesn't forget its own, and he showed up at the rehab facility the day I was cleared to leave, Biscuit's grandson panting in the back seat of his truck, tears standing plainly in his eyes when he saw me. 10 years I kept asking that man how you were doing, Walt said, gripping the wheel like it owed him money. Then one day he stopped answering the door. The storage unit was a 10 by 10 room of boxes I didn't recognize as belonging to a life I'd lived. In the third box, under a stack of design school sketchbooks, I found a manila folder I did recognize instantly. Thomas Reyes's handwriting on the tab. Trust, M. Voss, Patent and IP Holdings. I sat down on a cold concrete floor and read it twice. The trust Thomas had drawn up 3 weeks before my accident hadn't just moved my patent royalties into a standalone entity separate from marital property. It had also, per a clause I barely remembered agreeing to, named me as sole trustee with a designated successor trustee only in the event of my death, not incapacity. Which meant that for 10 years, while everyone believed, that our business assets had passed cleanly into his and Elisa's operational control after the divorce, the actual intellectual property behind our studio's most valuable ongoing contracts, the folding 4-pole mechanism and 2 subsequent design patents I'd apparently filed updates on in the 18 months before the accident, had continued generating royalty income into an account nobody but Thomas Reyes and I had ever had signing authority over. I called the number on the folder's letterhead with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Thomas had retired, but his old paralegal, a woman named Odalise Fuentes, still worked at the firm that absorbed his practice. She pulled the file while I waited on hold, and her voice changed the moment she found it. Ms. Voss, she said carefully, are you aware that trust has been accruing royalty deposits, uncontested, for the entire duration of your incapacity? Nobody's ever filed a claim against it. It's just been sitting there, compounding. How much? I asked. She told me a number that made me put my hand flat against the cold concrete floor to steady myself. For 10 years, while my husband and my sister had built a life on top of the business I'd started, believing they controlled everything of value that came out of it, they had never once known the actual engine of that value had legally and quietly remained mine the entire time. Grant had run the studio. Elise had run my house. Neither of them had ever touched the one thing that made either of those things worth running. I didn't feel triumphant, sitting on that concrete floor. I felt something closer to grief for the version of myself who had made that decision 3 weeks before losing everything, some instinct she'd had that I would spend the next decade trying to understand. Ms. Fuentes, I said, I think I need to speak with a lawyer. A different kind than my sister's husband thinks he's dealing with. I hadn't planned to walk into my old kitchen that first week home. I'd meant to ease into it, to let Denise's discharge protocols and my physical therapist's cautious optimism guide the pace. But Elise found out I was released before I found the nerve to call ahead, and by the time I arrived at what used to be my house, she'd already decided how this was going to go. She met me at the door like a hostess greeting an inconvenient guest. You should have called, she said. Grant's at work. This is a lot to just show up with. It's my house, Elise. It hasn't been your house in 4 years, she said, and there it was, the first small cruelty, delivered so casually she probably didn't register it as one. There's a guest room at the Hendersons' bed and breakfast on 9th. I already called and put it on our card. Our card. I stood on the porch of the house I'd chosen the paint color for, the house where I'd hung the mug rack on what I would learn was now the wrong wall, and I understood that Elise had spent 10 years quietly convincing herself this had always belonged to her. Over the following 2 weeks, the pettiness sharpened into something almost theatrical. She had my remaining boxes of clothing moved to Walt's garage for storage without asking. She stopped by the studio and told my old assistant, a sweet 26-year-old named Farah, that I was having a difficult adjustment period and shouldn't be given access to client files until things settle. She hosted a dinner party 3 doors down at the Kowalskis and, according to Priya, who'd been invited out of old habit, made a joke about Marin's little Rip Van Winkle situation that got an uncomfortable laugh from 6 people who used to be my friends. Grant, for his part, mostly avoided me, which felt almost like a mercy until I realized it was really just cowardice wearing a calmer face. When we did speak, briefly, at the studio doorway one afternoon, he said the thing that told me everything about how he'd spent the last decade justifying himself. "You have to understand," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The doctors said there was maybe a 2% chance you'd ever wake up. I gave you 3 years, Marin. 3 years is not nothing." "You gave yourself 3 years," I said. "Then you gave the rest of my life to my sister." Priya was the one who kept me steady through those first weeks. She showed up at the bed and breakfast with takeout and a bottle of wine I couldn't yet drink because of my medication, and she sat with me on the floor of a rented room and let me cry the tears I'd refused to cry in front of Elise. "You know what kills me," Priya said, refilling her own glass, "is that she's acting like she inherited a house. Like it just showed up on her doorstep, no strings, no original owner. People do that. They forget where things came from once they've had them long enough." "She has 30 days, I told her, thinking of the countdown Elise herself had unwittingly started when she mentioned, almost gloatingly, that the studio's annual patent royalty distribution to Voss and Cantrell Design, money she and Grant believed was theirs, was scheduled to hit their business account in exactly 31 days. 30 days until she finds out exactly how much of this was never actually hers to begin with. Odalise Fuentes referred me to a woman named Simone Achebe, a Boise attorney who specialized in exactly the kind of tangled mess I'd landed in, incapacity law, intellectual property, and the messy overlap where marital dissolution meets estate and trust structures nobody planned for. We met in her office on a Thursday, 3 weeks after my discharge, with the entire manila folder from the storage unit spread across her conference table like evidence at a trial. "Let's start with what you actually own, because I don't think you fully understand it yet," Simone said, sliding a legal pad across to me. "Your trust, established March 14th, 10 years ago, names you as sole trustee and sole beneficiary during your lifetime. It holds 3 patents, the folding 4-pole mechanism, filed under your maiden name 6 years before your accident, and 2 subsequent utility patents for surgical tray positioning hardware, filed 18 and 11 months before your accident, respectively." "I don't even remember filing those last 2, I admitted. "You filed them through a patent attorney named Kessler in Meridian. I pulled the records this morning." She turned a page. "Here's what matters. Your divorce decree, finalized under Idaho's incapacity dissolution statute, divided what the court believed to be your marital estate, the house, joint accounts, and operational control of Voss and Cantrell Design as a business entity. But it explicitly excluded separately held trust assets predating the marriage's dissolution proceedings, not disclosed as marital property. Your patents were never disclosed, Marin, because nobody involved in that proceeding knew they existed as a separate trust. Your guardian ad litem didn't know. Grant's divorce attorney didn't know. The court didn't know. So the royalties have been accumulating in an account only you and, until his retirement, Thomas Reyes had access to. Over 10 years, with 3 separate hospital supply licensing agreements and 1 additional licensing deal, Kessler's office closed on your behalf 4 years into your incapacity, because patent licensing renewals don't require the patent holder's active participation once the initial agreement is signed. That account currently holds $412,000 in accumulated, untouched royalty income. I sat with that number for a long moment. Simone let me. "Here's the part you need to understand clearly," she continued. "Voss and Cantrell Design, the business your husband and sister have been operating for the past 4 years, has been paying licensing fees this entire time, to your trust, for the right to manufacture and sell products based on your patents. They've been paying you, Marin. They just didn't know it, because the payments were structured as standard operational licensing costs that predated their takeover, and neither of them ever bothered to look at where the money actually went. And now you have two choices. You can quietly assume control of the trust, continue collecting the royalties, and let Grant and Elise keep believing the business runs the way they think it runs. Or, Simone leaned back. You can exercise your right as trustee to renegotiate or revoke the existing licensing agreements the studio depends on, effective in 30 days, which happens to line up almost exactly with the date they're expecting their annual distribution. They'll lose the studio, I said. Not a question. They'll lose the thing they built on top of what was always yours, Simone corrected gently. There's a difference, and you get to decide how much that difference matters to you. I'd also point out, and I say this as your attorney, not your friend, that revoking the licenses outright would tank the studio's value overnight, which affects employees who had nothing to do with any of this. Renegotiating from a position of full disclosure is the option that actually gives you leverage without burning down a building with people still inside it. I thought about Farah, my sweet former assistant, and about 6 other employees I hadn't seen in 10 years who were, in all likelihood, entirely innocent in this. I want them to know, I said finally. I want them to understand, in front of witnesses, exactly what they've been standing on this whole time. And then I want to decide, with clear eyes, what happens next. That, Simone said, closing the folder, I can build for you. The unraveling began quietly, the way these things almost always do, not with an explosion, but with a phone call Grant wasn't expecting. Simone's office sent a formal notice to Voss and Cantrell Design's registered business address, informing them that the trust holding the studio's core patent licenses was undergoing an ownership review, and that all current licensing agreements were subject to renegotiation pending that review's completion. It was dry, procedural language. It didn't mention my name specifically in the header. It didn't need to. I heard about the fallout from Farah, who called me in a panic 2 days later. Ms. Voss, I don't know what's going on, but Grant's been on the phone with the Meridian Patent Office all morning and he looks like he's seen a ghost, and your sister just left in tears, and I don't know who else to call. The hospital supply company that represented 60% of the studio's licensing revenue had, as part of standard due diligence triggered by the ownership review notice, contacted the studio directly to confirm who currently held authority over the underlying patents. Their compliance department, being appropriately cautious, froze the current licensing agreement pending clarification, not cancelled, just paused, but a pause is its own kind of earthquake when your entire cash flow depends on it landing on time. Grant called me that evening. His voice had none of its old charm left in it. "What did you do?" he said. "Not a question either." "I found out what I've owned this entire time," I said. "You should ask your business attorney to walk you through incapacity dissolution disclosure law. It's very educational. Marin, if this is some kind of payback." "It's an accounting," I said. "There's a difference, and I'd have thought after 4 years running a business you'd know it." The following week, the bank handling the studio's operating account flagged an irregularity in a routine audit. The annual distribution Elise had been counting on, the one she'd mentioned so casually weeks earlier, was held pending resolution of what the bank's compliance letter called a dispute regarding underlying intellectual property ownership. Elise, according to Priya, who heard it secondhand from someone at the Kowalskis' dinner party circuit, had gone to the bank in person and been told, politely but firmly, that there was nothing irregular happening on the studio's side. The irregularity was upstream, in the ownership of the patents themselves, and that was a matter between the trust and the studio's counsel. I imagine that was the moment it stopped feeling like an inconvenience and started feeling like a countdown. Grant showed up at the bed and breakfast unannounced on a Tuesday evening, and for the first time since I'd woken up, I saw something in his face that wasn't performance. It was fear. "I need you to tell me what you actually want," he said, standing in the doorway like a man who'd finally run out of rooms to retreat into. "Because if this is about hurting Elise, I understand it, but the studio employs 6 people who've never done anything to you." "I know exactly who it employs," I said. "That's why I haven't revoked anything yet. I've only asked to be recognized as what I already am." You're the one who decided that was a threat. Simone suggested we handle the disclosure formally, a private meeting with attorneys present, no theatrics, no audience. I told her I understood the wisdom in that. I also told her I didn't want it. 10 years of my life had been quietly redistributed without my consent, in rooms I wasn't in, by people who never once expected me to walk back into any of them. I wanted, for once, to be in the room when the truth landed. We held it at the studio itself, on a Friday afternoon, under the guise of what Grant had been told was a routine meeting with the licensing attorneys to resolve the account irregularity. Elise was there because Grant asked her to be, still believing, I think, that this was a negotiation between reasonable adults about paperwork. Farah and 2 other employees were finishing up work at their desks 20 feet away, well within earshot, which I hadn't specifically arranged but also hadn't discouraged. Simone laid it out clean and simple, the way she'd promised she would. The trust. The patents. The 10 years of royalty payments the studio had been making, unknowingly, to an account that had been mine the entire time. The dissolution decree's exclusion of undisclosed separate trust assets. The $412,000 sitting untouched. The licensing agreements currently on pause, pending resolution. Elise went very pale, very quickly. "This isn't real," she said. "You're telling me the whole studio has been paying royalties to Marin this whole time and nobody knew?" "Nobody looked," Simone said simply. "The payments were structured before the divorce and simply continued as scheduled. Nobody had a reason to check whose account they landed in, until now." Grant said nothing for a long moment, staring at the paperwork like it might rearrange itself if he waited long enough. Then he looked at me, and something in his face finally cracked open. "I told myself you weren't coming back," he said, quiet enough that only the people closest to us could hear it. "I told myself that for years, because it was easier than admitting I stopped waiting before I had a good reason to. I built a life on that story. I think some part of me needed it to be true." It was the first honest thing he'd said to me since I woke up, and it didn't undo anything, but I noted it, because Simone had told me weeks earlier that people rarely give you a genuine moment of humanity in the middle of a fight, and when they do, it's worth recognizing even if it doesn't change your plans. Elise didn't have a moment like that. What she had instead was fury. "You could have told us," she said. "Before the lawyers, before the letters, before you let this become a public humiliation, you could have just told us." "I tried telling you something, the first day I got home," I said. "You told me to go stay at the Hendersons. This is the version of telling you that finally got your attention." "You were gone, Marin." Her voice cracked around my name the same way it had that first morning in the kitchen. "I didn't take your life. I just kept it warm for you, because somebody had to." 10 years is a long time to keep something warm, Elise, I said, and this time I let the whole room hear it. "Long enough that you forgot whose it actually was." The studio didn't collapse, though for a few weeks it came close. Simone and I ultimately restructured the licensing agreements rather than revoking them outright. New terms, fair market royalty rates going forward, and a lump sum settlement from the frozen distribution that accounted for what I considered a decade of quiet, unknowing debt. The hospital supply company resumed the paused agreement within a month once ownership was formally clarified. Farah kept her job. So did the other 5 employees, which mattered to me more than I expected it to. Grant and Elise did not fare as well personally. The studio's reputation took a real hit locally. Word travels fast in a city the size of Boise, and the Coma wife story, as Priya bitterly called what people were whispering at the coffee shop, became something people repeated at dinner parties with a kind of relish reserved for genuinely good gossip. 2 long-standing clients quietly moved their contracts elsewhere, uncomfortable with the whole situation regardless of who was in the right. Grant, who had built his identity so thoroughly around being the reasonable, charming half of Voss and Cantrell, found himself instead cast as the man who remarried his comatose wife's twin sister, a label that followed him into rooms long after the legal dust settled. Elise took it harder. She'd never quite understood, I think, that the version of my life she'd been living was borrowed, not earned, and when the borrowing became public, something in her seemed to collapse under the weight of it. She stopped coming into the studio within 2 months. Grant told Priya, who told me that the marriage was strained, a word that felt almost funny given everything else that had happened. 6 months after the confrontation, Grant filed for divorce from Elise. I felt, to my own surprise, no satisfaction in it, just a tired, distant sadness for all three of us, for the version of my life that none of us would ever get back, no matter how the accounts settled. Elise moved out of state, to Spokane, where our cousin let her stay for a few months while she figured out her next move. She sent me one email before she left, 3 sentences long, that I read twice and did not respond to. I don't expect you to forgive me. I think some part of me always believed you'd stay asleep. I don't know what that says about me, and I'm not sure I want to know. I didn't answer it right away. I wasn't ready to, and Simone, of all people, told me that not answering was allowed to be its own kind of answer for a while. It was almost a year later, in the parking lot of the studio she no longer worked at, that Elise finally said the thing she'd needed to say in person. She'd driven down from Spokane for our late mother's headstone unveiling, a delayed family ceremony neither of us had been able to face until then, and she found me afterward, standing by my car, both of us still in the black clothes from the cemetery. "I'm not going to ask you to understand it," she said. "I've had a year to try to understand it myself, and I still can't fully explain how I let myself believe any of it was mine to keep. I think grief does something strange to people. I think I grieved you the way you grieve someone who's actually dead, and by the time you weren't dead anymore, I'd already built a whole life around the grief instead of around you." "That's not an apology, Elise. That's an explanation." "I know." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I am sorry. For the mug rack. For the Hendersons. For the thing I said in the kitchen, which I've thought about every single day since, because I meant it as an excuse and it came out as something much crueler than I intended it to be. I believed her, mostly. Grief does strange things to people. I'd learned that myself, in a different way, waking up to a decade I never got to grieve in real time. I'm not going to pretend this is fixed, I told her. I don't think it can be, not in the way it used to be. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life being angry at my own twin sister either. So here's what I can offer you. We can be sisters again, slowly, on different terms than before. Not roommates. Not partners. Not people who keep each other's lives warm while the other one's away. Just sisters, rebuilding something honest, at whatever pace that actually takes. That's more than I earned, she said. Probably, I agreed. I'm doing it anyway. Forgiveness doesn't require you to have earned it. It just requires me to be done carrying the weight of not giving it. We didn't hug. It wasn't that kind of moment. But she nodded and got in her car and drove back toward Spokane, and for the first time in over a year, I felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't fully realized was still clenched. 3 years after I woke up, Voss and Cantrell Design doesn't exist anymore. Not because it failed, but because I renamed it. Voss Studio operates out of the same converted warehouse near the river, employs 9 people now instead of 6, and holds 4 active patents instead of 3, including a new one I filed 18 months ago for a modular hospital bed rail system that took me most of a year to get right. I bought Grant out of his remaining stake in the building itself, using part of the trust settlement, and turned the old mug rack wall back to what it used to be, mostly out of stubbornness, though I'll admit it also felt like closing a small, silly circle. Farah runs client relations now and is better at it than Grant ever was, which I try not to say out loud too often because I don't need her getting a big head about it. Walt still waters my tomato plants whenever I travel, and Biscuit's grandson has a grandson of his own now, equally food-motivated, equally beloved. Priya's framing shop expanded into the space next door, and some mornings we still get coffee together before opening up, the same easy rhythm we've had since design school, uninterrupted by everything that happened in between. Elise and I talk most weeks now. Not every week, we're not there, and I'm not sure we ever fully will be, but most weeks, usually about nothing important, the way sisters talk when they've decided the relationship is worth maintaining even without the pressure of pretending it's fully healed. She's remarried, quietly, to a man in Spokane who has no idea about any of this history and, as far as I can tell, doesn't need to. I started something new this past year, too. A small foundation, funded partly by the trust, that helps cover legal costs for people navigating incapacity-related asset disputes. Spouses, adult children, anyone who wakes up, in whatever way people wake up from the different comas life puts them in, and finds their affairs quietly rearranged in their absence. Simone sits on the board. So does Odalise Fuentes, who left her old firm to work with us full-time. Last month, I hung a new mug rack in my kitchen, my actual kitchen, in a smaller house I bought myself 2 blocks from the studio, on the correct wall this time, holding, among other things, the same blue mug from Charleston. Some mornings I still catch myself standing in front of it, coffee in hand, thinking about a version of myself who signed a trust document on an ordinary Tuesday for reasons she couldn't fully explain, 3 weeks before an ice storm changed everything. I like to think she knew something the rest of us didn't. I like to think some part of her understood that the things worth protecting are rarely the things anyone else notices until it's too late. Here's what 10 years of sleep taught me. The people who borrow your life while you're not looking will always assume you're not coming back. Protect what's actually yours, on paper, not just in your heart, because paper is the only thing that still speaks for you when you can't speak for yourself. If you were in Marin's position, waking up to find your life rebuilt by the people closest to you, would you have chosen forgiveness? Or would you have walked away for good? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit subscribe, because there's another one coming next week that you won't want to miss.